This is One on One with Alex Kirsch, a podcast brought to you by the Alex Kirsch Project. I bring on one guest to talk about specific topics, whether they're political, social, economic, criminal, scientific, sports, or even entertainment. There are no tricks. Everything here is in good faith. The political spectrum is filled with many players in the game. You have elected officials who the populace will vote for to represent them, whether it's on the national stage or specific to their state and their districts. However, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Each state has lobbyists, special interest groups, and caucuses. Now, for historical context, the caucus was first formed in the 18th century in Boston. Their purpose was to form a consensus to achieve common political goals, whether they split into two groups, party caucuses and legislative caucuses. Now, the party caucuses gave voters a chance to gather with like-minded members of their party and find out who will be the candidate for their party in the next election. The legislative caucuses give those elected representatives the chance to meet with others with shared policy interests and objectives. Now today we'll be focusing on one specific caucus, which is relevant to the state of Michigan. The Rural Caucus, and today's guest is the Michigan Democratic Party Rural Caucus Chair, Mark Ludwig. He and I formally met last Saturday in Lansing during the Michigan Democratic Party Convention. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Mark to the Alex Kirsch Project. How you doing, Mark?
Pleasure to be here, Alex. Thank you.
So, first things first, why don't you go ahead and give us all a little bit more background about yourself, please?
I was born and raised here in Michigan. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula, went to high school kind of up in the tip of the mid area and then down in the thumb, so I've gotten around a little bit over the years. More recent years, I've lived on the southwest side of the state in Allegan County. Got a wife, got a kid, got a little farm. I do more politics these days than farming, but that's kind of it in a nutshell for me. And now I've risen to be a petty official within the Democratic Party with our rural caucus. And I could just roll right into what's the rural caucus if that works for you.
Oh, absolutely. Go for it. Please do.
So in 2017, a bunch of us kind of independently decided that the Democratic Party in Michigan needed a rural caucus, a place just to discuss the issues that are a little different for rural citizens than in people who live in larger urban centers or even small cities. And when we tried to break down who exactly that was, we couldn't figure it out. So Democrats, if you think you're rural, we'll be happy to have you here in the rural caucus. We're not that fussy. Proceeding from those days, we have grown substantially in both a number of people participating in kind of just general influence. We added a PAC a few years ago, which we used to distribute some money primarily to state house, state senate, and county commission candidates. Just really Michigan level candidates. And we've also in recent years been sending some people to Lansing to actually talk directly to legislators about policy. I think one of kind of the annoying things about rural America is that neither one of our parties really gets rural policy all that great. Whether it's dealing with things like the loss of rural hospitals, loss of economic opportunity as small manufacturing has kind of moved out of rural America, and just the disproportionate impact that climate change is starting to have on these communities. Everything's a little more expensive in rural America. Things like transportation and keeping the roads up really stress our small counties because there's just fewer people among who to spread those bills. You start implementing, impacting that infrastructure with climate change driven weather, and the cost is going to add up pretty substantially for rural America. So that's what we do. We've had a couple of summits the past two springs, which have just been an opportunity for Democrats to get together for a couple of days, talk about ideas and policy and politics, and how we do those two things in rural Michigan, and really the camaraderie. And I guess the last thing I'll say is the Democratic Party was really hungry for this. I can't tell you how many people are just thrilled to discover that there's plenty of Democrats out in rural Michigan, and then if we work together a little bit, we can really move things along.
Absolutely. And so at the Michigan Democratic State Convention in Lansing last week, I got invited by Joe Glutowski, friend of both of us, mutual friend of ours. And because I've never been to a convention like that, little background on myself. I grew up in the country as well, but I'm originally from the state of Oregon. But then I joined the Army and served 20 years in the Army. And my wife and I moved up here from Georgia. I don't know if I mentioned that really. But we moved up here, and I told my wife I want to live out in the country because city life, listen, it's a convenience to live in the city, but I hate the hustle and the bustle. I hate the traffic. I hate, the drama and whatnot. I mean, that's why I want to live in the country, because I grew up living in the country, and it's just it's like my favorite thing. And I absolutely love it. And because, like, living in a rural community, there's something like really key about it. And, excuse me. But like, what was really interesting is down in Lansing, the first, meeting I went to essentially was the rural caucus. And, we got to see a bunch of people speak, candidates are running. But the real surprise, I was not expecting to see Governor Gretchen Whitmer step in. And I really like what she had to say, talking about like how important the rural communities are. It's good for her to not forget the fact that the rural communities is one of the most essential parts of like keeping states flowing, because without rural communities, agriculture, what's it called? Animals, whatnot, like, because there's still plenty of meat eaters and stuff like that. But like the rural community is very, very essential to keep the country alive. Like without the rural community, like what else have you got? And she gave a lot of homage and she gave a lot of props to the rural community, which is really fantastic. And like I said, I was a little starstruck when I met her. I'm not gonna lie, I was like, oh, because I'm not gonna lie, because like when my wife and I decided to move to Michigan, because she's originally from Michigan, I started looking into like Michigan, and I started looking into Michigan politics, and I started looking at Gretchen Whitmer, and I was like, she's pretty awesome. Like, yeah. I think she's like a phenomenal governor. She's willing to work across the aisle. She doesn't play partisan politics. She cares about like what happens to the residents and the people of Michigan, and I really like that.
Yeah, she's a great example of a governor who takes seriously all our different constituency, and that's why it's funny because we kind of came up together. We are formed in 17. Whitmer's elected in 18, and it's been impressive to see her lean into some of the what you might call more populist issues. I think what people forget about rural areas as much as anything else is there's a taste for populism out here, and that's why Trump has been so effective. He talks about the kitchen table issues, and I think talks disingenuously about an America that never really was and wasn't really working for, and isn't really going to work for everybody. Mm-hmm. But far too often our Democratic Party is afraid of that populism. They're afraid to lean into the little things for the little guys, preferring instead to kind of buy into this Republican idea that, all boats are going to float up on a rising economy. Mm-hmm. And, maybe in the 60s and 70s, there was some truth to that still. But as the world economy has globalized, as things have become more and more difficult for smaller entities, frankly, as money and power has coalesced into fewer and fewer hands because of policy over the years, we really do need to kind of lean into a more activist government that's looking out for the little guy. And that's everything from, going after junk fees like the Biden administration does, like making sure that rural broadband is a super high priority. And I'll tell you what, in the communities that are doing that well, including ours here in Allegan County, people are just thrilled to finally have really good quality broadband instead of, I love my broadband provider. I know her by name. She's a good small business person, but sometimes I got to shut the camera off during meetings like this because I just don't have the bandwidth.
Yeah, I get it. Because when we first moved out here, we had DSL because that's all we could get in Tuscola County specifically in this area in the town I live in. The closest town I lived in, that's all they really had. It's either CenturyLink, which is what we had, or I can't remember all the other providers, but it was all crap. It was like bad services and you're not really get the bang for your buck. So we decided we're just gonna just break down and contribute to Elon. That it tastes like vinegar to say that, but it's just, but the thing is, like Starlink, it works. It gives me the chance to do this platform. So
Yeah.
honestly, it's not the worst thing ever. But like when the bipartisan infrastructure bill came out, the fact that so many people, especially people that voted against it, were trying to take credit for the fact that their communities, rural communities, were actually able to start getting broadband, good quality internet out there. Because let's face it, the internet is so essential nowadays, because if the internet was to crash tomorrow, fuel would not be able to get pumped. The stock market would crash. Groceries would shut down completely. The internet is pretty much like the second most important commodity after electricity, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, it's certainly very important, and as it increasingly becomes the backbone of things like control systems in our buildings, in our vehicles, and all of that. I mean, you got to have it, you got to do it right. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned electricity. We're in the middle of a huge revolution in how we're going to generate electricity. Mm-hmm. Specifically in Michigan, we saw Public Act 233 and a number of other rules, or a number of other laws passed almost a year ago now that are now just being furiously implemented. Mm-hmm. That's going to really change where our electricity comes from. Hopefully, it's going to improve, and I think will vastly improve reliability as we have the ability to, kind of fragment off pieces of the grid and in ways that make sense during emergencies. So, we can stand up whatever is still in good shape quickly, because we have things like distributed solar generation. Mm-hmm. And all of that. So it really is an exciting time for Michigan. And I guess how I would contrast ourselves with the Republicans at this point is that we're really looking forward. We want to build, the new battery plants that the Republicans are finding every ridiculous reason in the world to oppose. We're wanting to rebuild the distribution system in a more sensible 21st century way. Certainly. We want to address vulnerabilities. I mean, you were talking about the vulnerabilities to the internet. Just simply putting in, relatively manual backups in places so you can go turn systems back on, even if there's a hostile cyber attack, and keep things, limping along. Even if you've got problems, you're not catastrophically knocked out. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole lot going on. And there's a whole lot of challenges coming. We're in the midst of a huge baby bust. We have many more seats in our public universities and increasingly our private colleges than we can fill, particularly if we're going to keep, being this nation that's hostile to giving student visas and things like that. That used to, especially at my alma mater at Michigan State, we filled a lot of seats with foreign students. And really became a Spartan Nation became a global network of these alumni that were all over the world because of that, and gave us outsized influence around the world as manufacturing and things spread around the globe. So there's challenges. There's things like our long-term advantages that we're really doing a good job of playing to. Mm-hmm. There's a Chevy Bolt sitting outside my house here, built right here in Lansing, with a Korean drivetrain, but more or less an American battery. I mean, yep. What really is encouraging to me about where this state is at is that we had really decisive victories for our executive team this last election. And people just kind of reject this crazy destructive politics. Mm-hmm. I think particularly once we get beyond the person of Trump, hopefully in 2022, the attraction of this politics, I think, will diminish. That said, kind of getting back to the rural caucus and what we do, we had a real problem in the Democratic Party in that we kind of withdrew from rural America. Mm-hmm. Particularly during the Obama years, when there was a lot of talk about how demographics was destiny and the fact that we were going to have this majority-minority country was going to kind of put the Democrats into a permanent position of advantage. And I think the Trump years have really proved just how wrong that is. And the fact that we haven't been contesting elections in rural America as vigorously as we used to, that we haven't been pumping money from, our urban areas to, the rural corners to prop up our candidates. As frankly, the right wing does a lot. A lot of money flows from right wing think tanks, urban elite right wingers to hold up their rural candidates, because their rural candidates are viewed as winners. Mm-hmm. Our rural candidates are not always viewed that way. So in the institutional party, the super PACs and all of that, the independent expenders, they aren't paying any attention to those races. The rural caucus was really formed to a large extent to put that focus on the rural candidate. Hopefully over the years, we're going to move more money to the rural areas. I will also say there are a whole bunch of NGOs that sprung up, non-governmental organizations working on rural progressive issues. Mm-hmm. That in some ways have kind of diluted our effort, and I don't want to say it like it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to misunderstand. I like having those people out there, but it makes us a little hard to distinguish ourselves, as the official Democrats working on rural issues. If we've got 3, 4, 5 other, worthy progressive outlets to put your money and your thinking into.
Sure. Do you think also, like, at times, because, like, especially where I live at, there are not, like, we see, like, the amount of people that are registered to vote and they happen to be Democratic, and it's more than, like, the people that attend our monthly Democratic Party. And I've usually found out that, especially in rural parts of, like, because Tuscola is fairly rural, let's be honest about it, but, like, they're afraid of, like, kind of coming out and saying that they vote Democrat because of, like, the blowback they might receive. Do you think that's, like, the case with most other rural parts that people that vote Democrat, essentially?
It's a huge factor that you're kind of, I'm in West Michigan, that often, it comes up pretty promptly in some circles what church you go to, which, gets awkward if you've got the wrong answer or the answer is none. By the same token, it's like, almost what flavor of Republican are you if you're among political people? Now, Americans don't tend to lead with their politics. So, you don't always find out right away that somebody's, a Democrat or a Republican. But mm-hmm. There are definitely times when you feel like you're going to catch some grief for being a Democrat out here. I know there are people who I don't think are as friendly with me as they used to be. Because they're Republicans and I'm a Democrat. And it's really unfortunate that our politics has become so hostile that way. Yeah. And it's, my political awakening was early in the Reagan years. So I've been political for a very long time. And it's never been this stupid, I don't have another word for it, just stupid. There's no reason you should be angry at your neighbor because you're voting differently. And I even, another contact from the convention was actually an Austrian journalist, and I got talking with him about my good relationship with the county commissioners here in Allegan County. I sit on the County Conservation District Board, and I've chaired that body on and off over the 10 years that I've been involved. We get along fine, and we're able to conduct the people's business very effectively. We're in the middle of building a big new headquarters. Some of those commissioners were absolutely instrumental in helping us land a small millage for our organization that got us the money to build this headquarters, that have put us on a solid financial footing and helped us grow from 1.5 full-time equivalents 10 years ago to 5 FTEs. And I think by the end of 2025, it'll probably be 7, maybe as many as 8, depending on how the next couple of grant cycles go. Taking care of the people's business here in one of the biggest agricultural counties in the state. We're going to have more technicians working on that stuff. So it's unfortunate that it's gotten so hot when we're a rich country capable of doing such great things if we put our mind to it.
100% agree. mean, there are times like where I could be just as guilty, but the only thing is like my rule of thumb is like I only get hostile towards people that are equally hostile. Like I just try to measure the same energy, but like I'm willing to engage in good faith discussions with people that see differently from me, and I do it all the time. But there are times like where some people just get outright hostile. It's like, you know what? It's game on then. But, I try my best to just try to like maintain a calm composure the whole way across. I don't always succeed, but that's just, the nature of the beast. But like that's what I found is like with most rural communities, when people think rural, they think it's more conservative and they're going to vote Republican. And meanwhile, all the progressives will move to like the urban centers. But there are so many of us, especially in the rural communities, that vote Democrat. Me being one of them, honestly. And it's like, just sometimes wonder what it's going to take for them to kind of come out of the woodwork and say, you know what, it's okay. We got your back, essentially. I mean, what are some ways that you can kind of like draw people out from the rural communities, essentially?
Job one is showing up, and if we just show up, whether that's getting a seat on the parks board or getting on your local school board, serving on a planning commission, and many of these positions are appointed.
Mm-hmm.
So that means, first of all, just paying attention, and when seats open on these organizations, go volunteer for them. Alex, at any given moment, I think there's, a quarter to 0.5% of the people in the population who will sit on a parks board, do any of these minor government things that we need to do to successfully run our world. So there's always a need for those folks. People don't ask your party typically, even in a fairly polarized environment, to deal with things like that. More people running for office, and frankly, the Democrats contesting more offices we don't think of as winnable. We typically will always have a candidate for the state house. It's much less frequent to have a candidate for a county commission seat in these counties. It's getting to be practically unheard of to run a serious Democrat candidate in a red county for sheriff or for drain commissioner or for some of these offices, county treasurer, things like that. We essentially have conceded all of that ballot to the other party. And I think it's to the detriment of the functioning of government, because if there's literally no Democrats in your entire, in your entire county government, if every single officer is a Republican, that's where you can get groupthink and corruption and all of these things that lead to poor governance. And lastly, I think kind of circling back to, you're talking about, how you interact with people, and, you kind of mirror their approach. There's very little return as a political person for, to call people out, call them names, not so much not to call them out, but to engage in the kind of low name calling and all of that. And I'm not saying you don't call out bad decisions. You don't, that we're not here to talk about, how government could work better and to complain about things not going well. But there's a way to handle that is very professional, mm-hmm. that helps people take you more seriously. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of art in the current moment of being such an angry politics, to be able to do that effectively. It's really hard,
It is.
I allow myself exactly one forum where I'm really kind of a little snarky and mean on my local, my Allegan County Informed, Uncensored, or whatever it is. But even there, I don't call people names. I may point out in the funniest way possible that they're wrong. But even vulgar language and all that, I keep to very much to a minimum, just because it doesn't get us anywhere. And particularly when people are like, I don't understand how people can be so stupid. Well, you just lost your effort to try to reel that person in. Mm-hmm. You really got to start thinking about more kind of classic techniques of talking to people.
Mhm.
Oh, I hear what you're saying, and if I believed that that was true, I would feel like you do about such and such and such and so.
Yep.
And then you can work that pivot then and say, but in fact, what I understand to be the case with that issue is this. And I got to tell you, if we could start turning those conversations in a less hostile manner and circle back to our democratic policy priorities pull magnificently in rural America. You know, even things that you would think might be problematic, like universal health care, still 60+% popular.
Mhm.
Even reproductive rights, high 50s, easy. Uh, Reasonable gun control, again, high 50s, low 60s. And everybody thinks everybody out in the countryside is some kind of raging conservative, and it's really not true. A lot of them fall more in that middle ground than you might imagine. It's just that the people who participate in politics, they're louder, they're more aggressive. They take up a lot of the oxygen, and they drag their neighbors along, again, because we're not showing up, we're not contesting these races. I think of where we would be, for example, on the national race right now. The Harris Waltz ticket. If we had, if the rural caucus had been able to pump the $12,000 a candidate we would like to send out through our PAC instead of, 250, 500, which is what we've been able to do this year. Where would those candidacies be? How many more volunteers would they have been able to roll up? How many? And it's things like, buying a box of donuts and, keeping your volunteers happy so they want to come back again.
Yep.
Being able to, spend your time recruiting volunteers so you have enough so that, you can have young parents going out to canvass because you were able to provide childcare and snacks and things like that to your canvassers because you've got a bigger organization to work with.
Certainly.
That's that many more people, knocking those doors, doing the direct outreach it takes to actually, get people out to vote in the rural areas. We out here, we talk about losing less. We don't think we're necessarily going to get to the point where we're winning state house seats in deeply red counties like Allegan, but can we lose, can the Harris campaign, instead of losing by, 40 points, is losing by 35 points? Are we able to get to the point where we keep all of the state level races a whole lot more competitive, so we're not dealing with things like a Republican trifecta, because we almost always win the governor's race because we do better out in these rural areas.
Certainly. Yeah. The reason I was bringing up the whole controversial bit is because this generation, especially, we are drawn to controversy. I mean, that's why all these reality television shows is that's what everybody's focused upon, and that's probably why so many people are drawn to, former President Trump. It's because he's so controversial, because he draws himself in and people watch it because it's not because some people like him, but it's just because they give him that attention. And, yes, we definitely do got to be better about these things. And there are times where coming out and just coming out swinging, it gets people's attention. And especially in the social media circle, whether it's YouTube or Twitch or TikTok, all these others, those are massive platforms that people pay attention to. And if we can find a way for the rural caucus to get some kind, especially for the Democratic Party, to get out there and get more notice that way, that could also, I think, bring more people to our side. I mean, that's just a personal opinion. I mean, there's a lot more that I need to learn about the rural caucus, but that's one of the reasons why I invited you out here to talk more about that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, we would love to catch fire virally more often.
Yep.
And we, our primary, kind of conduit to our members is currently our Facebook page, which, and we also have a web page, for those who don't indulge in social media.
Yep. And that link's in this description below. So.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's kind of one of these catch-22 things. You've got to be loud enough to get attention. You've got to be entertaining enough to punch through. You've got to get enough momentum to get the algorithms on your side.
Certainly.
all of that can be difficult. At the same time, I don't want to be a bunch of clowns.
Sure.
I don't. I want to be able to be taken seriously, and also just as rural caucus chair, I really a couple times a year I got to get on the Facebook and say, we want to talk about rural issues.
Sure.
Every outrage from the Trump world does not need to appear on the rural caucus Facebook page. First of all, if you're trying to copy it over from your other 9 Democratic pages that you follow, I guarantee you most members of the Rural Caucus Facebook page are on some other Facebook page as well.
Yep.
It's hard to get people to focus in on when we're all such political animals and all of that. Kind of getting back to your you're saying everybody loves the drama and all of that. Yeah, yes and no. I think there's, that it's kind of like how much secret sauce you need on something. There you need a little bit of that spiciness. You need, and certainly to the extent we can push back on things that are ridiculous and be a little spicy doing it. I'm all for it, but I think there's a real hunger to kind of turn the page on this moment in politics. You really see the Harris campaign leaning into this, just like, can we just be done with all of this and move on? And maybe
I would love that.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of asking the GOP to put somebody normal up this next time around too. Yep. That'd be great. So I guess do we have to push back a little bit? Yeah, do we have to be a little spicy and funny because of the modern world? But I'd rather be accused more often of being too serious and
sure
grinding away on the issues too much.
Which is a great segue, actually, because I do want to talk about like the biggest issues affecting rural communities, if you're up for it.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, in all the time since the caucus has performed, has there been a consistent issue that people in the rural community, doesn't matter what county, that people have faced? For example, costs, fuel, water. You mentioned climate change earlier, but is there one consistent issue? Because here's the thing. Farmers, people in agricultural industries, people in rural communities, there's always one issue that kind of ties them all together, regardless of their political background. It doesn't matter who they vote for. But there's always that one issue that definitely ties them together. What would you say that one issue is, or one of those issues is, essentially?
Alex, the thing to remember is we're all people and we're all living here in America, and we've got a lot of the similar problems, be it rural or urban. Mm-hmm. They just come in slightly different flavors.
Sure.
Good example is healthcare.
Yep.
If you're living in a large city, you have a heart attack, you can be in a hospital emergency room in 10, 20 minutes, no problem. You can be seeing a specialist within an hour. You can be medevaced to, if you're really damaged in a car accident or somebody shoots you, you can be in a level 1 trauma center within an hour or so, easy peasy. Mm-hmm. Now paying for it, all of these other things we know from dealing with American healthcare, that's still a big issue. But as far as just pure access, no problem. So that's not your problem in urban America. That's a huge problem in rural America. And, you talk about Michigan, start thinking about the UP, where you are caught between a couple of Great Lakes for most of that. You can scoot across the bridge there in Mackinac, but that is almost all the way over on the eastern side. You can go south from the western UP to Green Bay or Milwaukee or something like that. But I mean, if you have a heart attack, if you have a car crash, if you cut yourself with a chainsaw, boy, you better hope you've got the best freaking EMTs in the world. And in a lot of ways they do. These people deal with this every day, but it's a whole different ballgame as far as access.
Sure.
If you survive some kind of traumatic event and you've got to get physical therapy or you've got to do follow-up appointments, you may have to drive 70, 80, 90 miles to go to a follow-up appointment. To see a specialist, you might have to stay overnight in Green Bay or in Petoskey or Traverse City. It's a really different world out there. And, you start talking about rural America where things really get thin out in the Dakotas and things like that. They're facing very similar problems. The economics of running a hospital in rural America are very difficult. And again, that kind of gets back to my comment about, our policies. We often kind of overlook, or at least, rural policy is not our first thought. It's kind of like, we kind of get it all done and then I'm like, oh yeah, what needs to be different for those guys out there? Economic opportunities huge in rural America. The 2008 recession wiped out a lot of small manufacturers in rural areas, and certainly the COVID crisis didn't do them any good either. A lot of that employment never came back, and it really did a lot of damage out here. Price of energy is very difficult for some people. Just the price spread between natural gas and propane, particularly the propane's got to be transported long distance, can be a really big deal. Electricity costs in the UP in particular are insane. The only people in America who pay more for their electricity are in Hawaii. So there's some very specific things there. I think diseases of despair, alcoholism, addiction, really hit rural America hard. And you want to look at the real beating heart of the Trump resentment. It's watching some kid who, broke his knee in high school playing football, got addicted to OxyContin and was dead, and, of a fentanyl overdose 10 years later. There's these stories of just damage. And, Trump gave everybody a plausible answer. Who did this to you? Mm-hmm. Well, a nebulous elite. And then you just fill in whoever you think the villain is, depending on how your favorite conspiracy theory about whose fault it is.
George
but usually,
Soros.
George Soros or undeserving minority persons of various kind. I mean, there's been a story of that tapped into a resentment that was legitimate, and I think provided an illegitimate answer. Mm-hmm. Because it really, to my mind, it is not what the Republicans say it is. It's been 40 years of bad tax policy, disinvestment, and the hollowing out of the middle class job market in favor of these trickle down ideas, or this idea that somehow the very wealthy would rescue all of us. And
yeah,
I think fortunately the young folks aren't really buying that anymore. There's more and more people who are, even if they don't agree with our solutions, or at least starting to see the problem along those lines. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, if I was going to say we're, like I said before, we got to lean in a little bit to the populism. We got to see why folks are so damn upset and voting for Trump. And remember, a lot of them voted for Obama first, mm-hmm. For similar reasons, because he had some solutions he was putting out there, and and he leaned in a little bit more to that story of that populist story. That the one thing I say that I never want to fail to get on something and say is, when we're talking about politics, you want to do it in the order of story first, values second, and policy third. If you're a candidate trying to sell yourself and you're not working through that and you're just jumping right into, I'm going to go up the lamp thing and I'm going to do all this, blah, 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 you just lost, man.
Yeah. No, you're 100% correct, because so there was a book I'd read or listened to. It was by Mehdi Hasan. You're familiar with him, right?
Yes.
It was the book, How to Win Every Argument. And he actually talks about, when he gave, an argument as to why, we should cut ties with Saudi Arabia. He put names of people that were, protesters. He put names to them because it gives personality, essentially. And I think that's so vital. For example, if people were to talk about, for example, why I'm pro-choice and why it's essential to make sure that women have a choice. I could bring up the story of like Katie Cox, a woman that actually knew that she had a down in Texas. She knew that she was gonna have a pregnancy that was not gonna come to term. It was going to eventually die. She needed to get care, taking care of it, and essentially, and she and her husband wanted to keep this baby, but the fact of the matter is that she had to terminate this pregnancy, but because of an overarching government, an overreaching government, Ken Paxton, the AG, was basically telling her no, essentially. When you put a person's face to it, and essentially when you it makes it more believable and it makes it more real, essentially. And I think you're the second person I've talked to that says that in rural communities, healthcare is really important. When I talked to April Ostentowski, who's running for the 98th district for state representative, she brought up the fact that if let's say, for example, if you are up in Bad Axe, where she's out of, there's no major hospitals in that area. If you had a medical emergency, it's going to take you at least an hour to get to a nearby hospital. And what do they have? They have mobile EMT centers. And I'm not trying to knock the people that work those mobile EMT centers, but it's not adequate care because anything could happen in that ambulance. Say, for example, oh my God, we got to take a detour real quick. That's adding another 20 minutes to that route, essentially. What more could happen in that 20-minute detour, essentially? And, and she brought the fact that there's also not enough care centers like for women that are expecting, because when people say, oh, Democrats are all for killing babies. No, we're not. We're just all for about women having a choice. Democrats are just as much pro like people having strong functional families as anybody, essentially. But you also have to have the facilities to take care of, expecting mothers, essentially. And that's also an issue. In a lot of rural areas, there's not enough centers or hospitals where women can get adequate care. And it's things like that I feel like that's kind of cast to the wayside. People think, oh, well, why don't you just pick up and move to an urban community? Well, first things first, okay? That is such a big ask, especially for somebody that, like, you've built your entire livelihood working in agriculture, and now you have to pick up and move, essentially. That costs money to do all that stuff. And there's no guarantee you're going to get a job if you move to the urban community. So why is it we just can't bring more healthcare? Why can't we build more hospitals or more adequate hospitals that are closer to the rural communities? I mean, it's things like that. I mean, I don't know why this
it's not even. Yeah, and to a large extent, it's not so much the infrastructure is not there. It's just it's become uneconomical to run. A hospital period, and often like you said, things like a birthing center, which have become more complicated. They have more services, and frankly, I mean, think about it from the perspective of the young mother. Okay, it's great to have emergency obstetrical services everywhere. Granted, now if you're going to your doctor and they say to you, well, you could have your baby here and this far corner of Michigan, or we could, when you get close, we could take you down to Traverse City and have you in a bigger hospital. Does that, the fact that we do all this choosing in medicine these days, is that going to make it unviable or to have an obstetrical center? I guess maybe the better way, it's kind of an awkward example I'm giving, but
no,
I guess the better question is how many, births do you need to have, to make having an obstetrician a viable position in these hospitals? Because frankly, one of the big problems is, some of it's economic, some of it's just that we're losing population.
Yeah.
And, and we're losing population of childbearing age in these areas. So even with the best of intentions, it may be very difficult to keep these departments open, and we may have to think about a plan B. You're talking about your kind of better equipped EMTs as an answer to not being able to get to a hospital. That may be the best we can do. And then the question becomes, well, what does that look like? What does that look like to be effective healthcare, in Michigan in the 21st century? And part of it is, you have to get past that, constant opposition. Oh, your idea is stupid and we're not going to do it. No, we've got to preserve the hospital at all costs, or, we've got to let the free market just sort this all out. There's a middle ground in there where it's worthwhile for you as a citizen of Michigan to have, healthcare that's realistically going to be able to address your situation if you have a car accident when you're way up in the UP on vacation. You know, you've got to kind of spread out the understanding of what is, you know, what's the public good look like, because it doesn't mean just that there's decent facilities in your neighborhood. It means that when you're traveling and you have a problem, there's decent facilities everywhere.
Sure.
So there's, you know, if we could kind of get past some of these arguments about things that are, you know, ridiculous, like all of this, you know, endless chattering on about election security when it's really never been a problem. You know, it's just
really
one
isn't.
of the parties decided they had, you know, they were so desperate to hold power that they've got to just, you know, first a little bit and then a little bit more and then a little bit more. And then they hit this critical mass under Trump where this narrative about election security explodes and takes up all kinds of time on a local level, drives all kinds of people out of the business of being a township clerk or a county clerk, you know, causes all of this, you know, rage and anger across the country. You know, there's only so much time and effort and money and hearing time and committee time and all of that to deal with all of these problems that are coming at us, whether it's the aging of the population, whether it's loss of rural population, whether it's, you know, loss of economic viability among farms. I have watched as the economic viability of farms of the blueberry industry has completely eroded for a lot of people the last 15 years because suddenly overseas farms were making many more frozen blueberries than they used to. And suddenly a big part of their market disappeared.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fields that used to be harvested in my area that aren't harvested anymore. Same thing's going on up north in Traverse City area when it comes to tart cherries. We are the biggest producer of tart cherries in the country. Mm-hmm. And that industry is completely at risk of being driven out or being driven into just being a little specialty crop in that area because there's so much competition coming from overseas. And, you know, weird little things you don't see coming. Like there's a new fruit fly that's chewing through the fruit industry that makes production of cherries more expensive, you know. And we really ought to be asking ourselves as a society, you know, are there things we could be doing to make sure that, you know, these changes in agriculture aren't devastating to those farmers, that, you know, Traverse City can still have a Traverse City Cherry Festival with locally produced cherries instead of buying them from Turkey. Mm-hmm. You know, there's, you know, there. And look, I'm not saying that we aren't going to essentially get to the solution where we just say, you know, the markets are the markets. We can't solve that. But it seems to me these are questions that we ought to be asking and things we ought to be working on.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to do a follow-on, but you brought up an interesting point earlier regarding, like, people leaving. But, you know, in one of our most recent meetings in my county, there was a gentleman that talked about how people were leaving his town because the local grocery store closed, which that is, like, there are some towns that have only one grocery store. And if that grocery store closes down, that could cripple an entire town, essentially. Because, you know, how else are people going to get the groceries? Because then you got to drive like an extra 20 miles. Now, some people might think 20 miles, it's not a big deal. It actually is a big deal for some, honestly. And it's interesting you bring that stuff up because, and that's why, like, in an urban setting, well, I can't shop at Aldi. I'm going to go to Walmart. It's right up the road. But for some towns, like the local family grocery store that's been open since 1927 and it's now closed down, that is a huge impact because it's sort of like a, what's it called? How do I really put this? There's like a sentimentality to it, but it's also like, it's the familiarity of, I used to shop, I grew up shopping at that grocery store and now it's not there anymore. What do I do now, essentially? Because farmers markets are usually on Saturdays. Right. I need groceries now. Where am I going to go to now? Well, I got a Dollar General, but wait, that just closed down too. So what am I going to do next? I got to drive 20 miles further down the road to go to the next grocery store. These impacts, especially in rural communities, is at times devastating, honestly. Now, is that something that's also been brought up with their rural caucus at times?
Yeah, you know, it's a great point, Alex. You know, often we think of, we talk about food deserts and we think that's, you know, some urban corridor that, you know, that can't support a grocery store. Same thing happens because of thinning populations and just changes in where and how people shop. And it's not just grocery stores. If you have if you've got a big box store like Menards in your area or Lowe's, something like that, it may become difficult for, a little town to support a hardware store if people are going to drive an extra 20 minutes to go to a big box store to save, a few cents a piece on pieces of hardware. Particularly if they're already going to that town so they can go to Myers and shop because their grocery store went down. Or, there's the biggest disruptor of all, the internet. Amazon, can bring you all kinds of parts. I mean, I've been a maintenance manager in an industrial setting and in a nursing home setting. Amazon's an absolute game changer for me.
Yeah.
Because I can get online, I can find any piece of obscure weird hardware I need. I can have it there the next day, and I don't have to get up out of my factory or away from my job, spend 20 minutes going down to the hardware store, 20 minutes back, 20 minutes shopping there. I mean, that's an hour of my time. My 50-cent bolt actually costs $26 because of the amount of salary I'm drawing and the mileage I'm going to charge my employer. If Amazon can get me the same part cheaper and in a bigger bag of parts, it kind of killed me to do it every time I had to do it. But, on the other hand, it made my life so much easier. So, there's a certain amount of sentimentality, like you said, about keeping open our traditional retailers. That is not going to save you from a bottom line that isn't penciling out. Now, what do you do in extremely remote corners of remote areas? I have heard of unmanned food co-ops. I've heard of essentially untended grocery stores where you punch in a keypad, you go inside, you do your shopping, you run through the self-checkout. You got a couple of cameras in there in case somebody's stealing too much food. And this is a way to keep a grocery store open where maybe it's not viable to pay somebody to sit there and be a grocery clerk. It's more important to have them come in, stock the shelves,
Yep.
And people can figure it out for themselves. You talked about Dollar General being, we see jokes about, they kind of bloom like mushrooms every time it rains. Is that our ideal solution to retail in rural America? No. Are people going to take it for, a gallon of milk and, a few general small items? Yeah. And, maybe if, you're looking around and the only retail in your area is Dollar General, maybe the thing people need to do is get more involved in their Dollar General and make sure that they actually get, they've got the SKUs you need for your local area. People are awfully creative, and there is a lot of creativity built into our capitalist system. And even though sometimes it looks like a disaster, there's often interesting things that happen as situations like the dollar store phenomenon develop that may prove to be effective. Probably one of the most effective grocery stores in my area is a tiny little Spanish-owned store. You might call it a bodega. Definitely caters to a Hispanic customer base, but it is always busy.
Yeah.
And it is a good place to shop. I would be surprised if there's 4,000 unique SKUs in that store. But, if you need a gallon of milk or, a dozen eggs and really great avocados, it's dynamite. It's exactly what our little area needs. So I think there is some resiliency out there. I think the question is, how do you encourage that resiliency? How do you make sure that, a little independent bodega like that can succeed? What can we do policy wise to make sure that that's possible and that kind of thing can go on?
Certainly. And that's, once again, you're helping me basically segue into my next question, basically. So when farmers or members of a rural community, bring issues to your attention, because I'm sure you've probably heard them, how do you go about addressing them to the next higher echelon, essentially?
our lobbyist Joe Katowski certainly speaks very candidly with different legislators in both parties about effective rural policy. When things are brought to us, we're typically going to stovepipe that along to our electeds or our candidates. And Alex, I got to say, it's the same like 10, 12 problems over and over again with, occasionally spicy this and that. But I don't think there's a lot of mysteries about the problems we've got in rural America. I think the mystery is how do we get enough money and political will and agreement on what to do programmatically to move things forward. And a lot of it's like will and money. Like internet development is charging forward across rural America because the Biden administration stuffed a whole bunch of money for rural broadband into their recovery plan, period. I mean, that's what did it. And there's gains to be had with regulatory reform. You only have to look at, Public Act 233 and the other renewable energy bills that went through in 2023 that are going to very much change the ability to site renewable energy across the state. It's really jump-started the discussion, both with zoning reform, which I think could be huge, honestly, across Michigan for so many things, and also by providing funding. I mean, there are many communities that are going to get $5,000 an installed megawatt for agreeing to put large-scale solar, wind, and battery facilities within their jurisdictions. And that's what we got to do to make things work. So often we are just afraid to use the vast economic power that this country has to move things forward for the little people. It's always, it gets sucked up on things that like, new stadiums for billionaires, which, it's baffling to me that we think that's a good use of our money. And, putting $5,000 a megawatt in the hands of a local government is somehow extreme.
Yeah.
We really are kind of, I think, at a moment of a redefinition of what good public policy looks like. And the Biden administration's brilliance has really been putting the economic welfare of average Americans at the center of it instead of the economic power of the very wealthy and powerful, which has been the priority for a very long time.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up green energy because that was actually going to be my next questions as well, because everywhere I drive around, and I drive around the state of Michigan pretty frequently. It's part of my job as a truck driver. And I see a lot of people say no solar farms. You see a lot of people out there that are very anti-green energy. So basically my next question is, how is it you sell the concept of green energy, like whether it's solar or wind, to these rural communities? Like, how is it? Because there are people out there that think, well, why should I switch to solar energy or wind energy? Because I've got gas and it works just fine. Like, why would I want to? I heard that solar energy, it doesn't really do anything. Wind energy doesn't really. It takes away your land value essentially. So how essentially do you sell this concept to rural communities essentially?
I think you start by the facts, some important facts. I mean, first of all, when there's a lot of people talking about there's so much land going to go under panels, we're going to lose all kinds of agricultural land. We're talking about losing maybe 2 to 3% of our farmland base to solar installations. And I think you're going to find those are going to be pretty concentrated near urban areas and near small towns where the market's relatively nearby, because line losses are real. There's going to be an emphasis on areas where there's good infrastructure to move that around, the towers and such. How do you sell it? Necessity for one, just talking about the importance of meeting what we've got to do for climate change. And there are people who will say, well, climate change isn't real. And I don't know how to talk those people around at this point. I really don't. Yeah. I mean, If we can have a summer like last year where it looked like hell had literally come to earth and Canada burned down, followed by a winter that was barely winter here, where the UP took a hell of a beating because their winter tourist industry just never really materialized. I don't know how to get past the denial. Setting those people aside, I will say this particularly about the farm community: everybody wants something from them. There's always people at their door trying to sell them something. They have seen a lot of people come and go talking about money and buying things and leasing this and growing that. So there's a healthy skepticism there that you got to overcome. I think money talks, making sure that it pays fairly, and also, you know, we used to say among some of my friend Fitz the farm, you know, sometimes there's something you're doing that really doesn't fit your neighbor's operation. If you are, you know, a really successful farmer and you need every square inch you've got, your cash flow is fine. You know, I don't see why you would take a solar lease unless you really wanted to. On the other hand, if you're retiring, none of the kids are interested in taking it on, you'd really like to live out your days on your family farm and maybe keep that land in the family in case some number of generations down the road people are interested in. You know, you view land as your wealth base, which many of these folks do. You know, then that, you know, $1,000, $1,500 an acre per year for a solar lease, that makes a ton of sense. You know, particularly if, you know, you can put it on part of your farm and still maybe farm some of the other areas. I think that's really important. A lot of it too is I've found is just swatting down disinformation. You know, there's no eminent domain seizure of land to put up solar panels or windmills. That's not a thing. Mm-hmm. It is a thing for putting up transmission lines, but that goes way back to the feds. That's been buried in, you know, Michigan and federal law for decades. Same thing with pipelines. You know, those right of ways have much more governmental authority behind them. I will say this is, you know, kind of my day job is working on this issue. This is going to be a super hot topic in Michigan for a couple of years, and I think you're going to see thousands of acres of land leased. And you're also going to see thousands of acres that have been optioned for renewable energy not used because they couldn't put a big enough block together. You know, they couldn't get the transmission issues sorted out. They made better deals with other people. So, you know, you're going to hear not only stories of, you know, happy stories of, you know, I'm going to be able to retire now, da 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 da. You're going to hear angry stories of people made me promises and I had these options for a long time and then they didn't exercise the options, so I never got the lease. There's going to be a blend of that for a while. So it's kind of buckle up, my friends, because there's going to be a lot going on the next couple of years. Beginning with writing a whole bunch of new ordinances over the next 3 or 4 months to conform with the new state laws. So lots to talk about, lots to think about.
Absolutely. And I remember the League of Conservation Voters, I think they had a Zoom meeting about a year or so ago talking about how Governor Whitmer actually signed a bill to basically make Michigan as what's it called? Green energy dependent by 2030. Yeah. Do you think that's at all possible, or do you think that's kind of doesn't sound very pragmatic?
I believe it's 60% by 2030.
Okay.
So let's start there. Do I think it's possible? Yes. Do I think it's 100% going to happen? I don't know. We're building a phenomenal amount of renewable energy capacity in this country right now. There's a couple of states that were way out in front of us, where kind of the wind developers ended up after they got chased out of Michigan about 10 years ago by a lot of zoning hassles. Some of those big developers are already saying they're coming back and they're starting to look at Michigan again. And I would guess there's a lot of leases hanging out there. The energy industry has every incentive to nail down as many leases as they can the next 2 years before the end of the Whitmer administration, just in case the government returns to Republican hands and they decide they've got to roll a bunch of this stuff back. If they've already got their leases in place, if they've already got their permits taken care of, and it's already a done deal, that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So I think you're going to see. And once they have their lease in place, they've got 5 years to implement it. So you're going to see a ton of action. I think it could get us to 60%. I mean, this is the country that, from 1939 to 1945 went from kind of a small player on the world stage to an absolute dominant power because we put our mind to it. We realized we had a real problem, and we did something about it.
Yeah.
This country's got incredible capacity, and frankly, we can harness the capacity of China, of Germany, of other manufacturing powerhouses to build us things because our money's still pretty good.
Yeah.
And for all of you who are like, oh, our money's getting blah, blah, blah. Yeah, guess what? Everybody else in the world's money sucks more than ours does. So we are still an absolute economic juggernaut. And frankly, if we taxed the very wealthy a little harder and put that money toward, incentivizing green energy and such, they're sitting on mountains of money.
And one of the things that I really love about what you just talked about is because I remember when, Secretary Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, went before Congress, and they're trying so hard to trip him up, but you can't trip that guy up. He's way too good. And the thing is he's way too humble. He will never admit that he's that smart. But the thing is, you cannot trip the guy up. He says either we control the market of battery power or solar power or green energy, or China does. And, you got the Republicans always talking about, oh, well, we need to be the top dog in everything. Well, in that case, let's be the top dog in green energy. Let's be the top dog in, battery powered cars, And, I may not buy a battery powered car just yet because it's just there's long story short, because my wife and I, we have horses and we need to be able to haul those horses. And as of right now, there's no trucks out there that are battery powered that can sustain like we need it. But the fact of the matter is, that doesn't mean we can't be there in the next 5 to 10 years, essentially. So Why can't we be in control of that market? That's why when the CHIPS Act came out, where they're building semiconductor plants all across the country, even though, yes, Taiwan is still helping us out in that regard, and other countries, getting us in the market and keeping us competitive with China, I think, is good. It's really good. And what does it also do? It gets jobs, because semiconductor jobs are the way of the future, essentially. And I'm not saying that there's not other jobs out there, especially within rural communities, but the fact of the matter is, you can afford more people, more opportunities out there, because what do semiconductor chips do? Cell phones, cars, computers. It's the way of the future, essentially. And that's why it's so important. People have got to be thinking forward. And that's why, when I say I'm a progressive, it's because I like to think forward. I don't want to go backwards. I don't want to go just because this system has always worked in the past, just because, because I drive a gas-powered engine as well. But eventually, we could get to a point where it's not going to be necessary anymore. We're still going to use oil products. We're still going to use petrol products of some sort. But the fact of the matter is, if we can get to a point to where it's more economically feasible and it's safer, essentially, why not start working on the technology to get us to that point, essentially? But there are people out there that say, no, I can't go with this because it's just this, socialist communist ideology that's trying to get us. No, listen, you're not thinking clearly, okay? And I start telling people, it's like, listen, if you don't want to buy one, you don't have to buy one right now. But eventually, the market might be there. It's like, you know what? maybe it's time for me to buy one. So why can't we just do more and have these semiconductor plants, have this green energy out there, have these opportunities out there to get us in the way in the future? So I feel like I've been ranting as well. So
No, let her rip, Alex. Let it out, man. I think not only I think one of the things that is really pushing the whole green energy revolution forward is the economics of it. 20 years ago, it really required significant subsidy to make these projects cash flow, and that's just not the case anymore. We're to the point where both wind and solar are efficient enough that they're economically advantageous over fossil fuels. The electric cars of today are very expensive because we don't make very many of them, and because we're not taking quite as much advantage of mass production at many steps in the process of making, my beautiful little Chevy Bolt out in the driveway. It's hard to charge enough money for that car to make it cash flow at this point. So both Ford and GM lose money on their electric vehicles right now. That said, they are so much simpler. There's just a whole whale of a lot fewer parts in that car. There's just a whole lot fewer things that can go wrong and cause recalls in that car, which people miss what a huge expense it is when you got to pull these vehicles in for a recall. I think, and you only have to look at China that's really ahead on electric cars. There's a very good reason the Biden administration slapped 100% tariff on electric cars coming out of China, because it'd be like looking from the future back on when Japan ate Detroit's lunch in the 80s. And I went to high school down there. I got to watch that from a front row seat.
Yep.
If you saw that coming and you could stop it, you should. And that's what the Biden administration did. They said, hold up, we need a few more years for American manufacturers to figure out how to make these cars more affordably.
Yep.
And I think we're going to get there. I think within 10 years, particularly if the challenges of expensive batteries are able to be addressed, electric cars are going to win for the same reason, because they're just going to be a lot cheaper, both to buy and also to drive. My car's advantage right now is that it's ridiculously cheap to drive around, and it's also much more efficient, for energetically. If you take oil out of the ground and you burn it and generate electricity in a very efficient process and put it in your electric car gets more miles out of that than your gasoline car does, is if you took that same gasoline and fueled your car up for it. Just because of things like regenerative braking, the fact that there's very little thermal loss with electricity. There's just all kinds of things that go into the electric car, which just make it fundamentally a better car. Now, does that mean that, we're going to get to the point where your horse trailer is going to be pulled by an F-150 Lightning? Yeah, it's going to be a few more years for that. But, I will tell you that a lot of small contractors, if they're building houses, they kind of like those electric pickup trucks because they don't have to start up a generator every morning. They just charge their truck up overnight and they plug into that thing all day long to run their compressor and run their nail guns. So, we're going to see electric vehicles pop into industries in ways we're not expecting. It's going to take longer for electric vehicles to penetrate every different sector, but particularly for the average person who just needs a car to commute 100 miles or less one way, it's the economics of it just make a ton of sense. Even like the Uber folks, it's so much cheaper to operate an electric vehicle that driving Uber with an electric car actually makes that pencil out a whole lot better. Yep. So even with the hassle of having to go plug it in and kill an hour while you get charged back up, it makes a ton of sense.
Which is interesting that you brought that up, because when I interviewed Clint St. Mosley, one of the things I talked about was like regarding public transportation and talked about transportation in general, because in the 9th district alone, there are, I think it's like, I could be wrong, but like about 30% of the people that live in the 9th district they have to commute about 90 plus minutes there and 90 minutes back. Now, there are people out there that think that's not that big of a deal. It is a huge, huge deal. So things like that, like where you're talking about like people needing to commute, a green energy car could actually save them a great deal because, say for example, I sometimes hypotheticals work. You're stuck in traffic. Why? Because they're doing road construction, right? You're just burning unnecessary gas fumes. And granted, there are always cases like where, maybe you didn't charge your car overnight and now you're about ready to die or something like that. That could happen. But that's just, like the term PPP, piss poor planning, essentially. It happens. Yeah. And people have those days. But it's just the carbon footprint, it all adds up eventually. And if more people get on board with this, the more the carbon, look what happened like when people were driving less during COVID. The carbon footprint cleared up. LA, you can actually see LA from, I don't know if you've ever been out that way. Like from 20 miles away, you could see the smog from I-10. Honestly, like 20 miles away, you can see the smog. And and I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm simply pointing out that like the carbon footprint is there. And it's little things like that we just don't think about until we actually see it. We see the benefits of it, essentially. That's why, again, maybe later down the line, I'll probably get an electric car. But like, if people don't want to buy one, don't buy one. It's that simple. But if you feel it's economically feasible, by all means, get one, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and people are worried about a sudden transition, and I've heard people talk about, we're going to overload the grid and blah, blah, blah. The average car spends about 13, 14 years on the road from cradle to grave. They don't just vanish overnight because the technology changes. It will. We're going to have a 20, 25, 30 year transition. Through as the different petroleum powered vehicles slowly disappear. We really don't have the infrastructure yet to be able to conveniently charge. You can do it, but it's not easy. And when I took my electric car to the UP, it really sucked a couple of times. But it's doable, and it's. I'll give you an example of how things are going to change. I probably charge my car 85, 90% of the time at home. Mm-hmm. So I don't go to the gas station anymore and buy gas. Well, that means I'm not going inside and getting a donut I don't need, or picking up a gallon of milk or whatever. As people aren't. Are charging at home, it's going to change that kind of retail fuel sales. It's going to change the repair industry. It's like I said, it's a much simpler vehicle. Mine, I drive in a mode called one pedal driving. When I'm pushing down on the pedal, it goes. When I let up, it regenerates all that energy into the battery. I barely touch the brakes. I don't expect to ever have to do a brake job on my car. It's one of the things we should be doing in politics, pushing things in the right direction. That's, Whitmer and the legislature's big package of clean energy legislation. It's preparing, infrastructure things such as charging stations. We're finally going to put a bunch of charging stations up in Detroit. Hallelujah. And also, I think we really have to take a frank look at where the global economy is going, where's climate change going, and how's that going to, what can we do to make sure that the little people in this country aren't squeezed ridiculously hard by these factors that are coming at us? Because honestly, because of the climate denialism the past 30 years, we're way behind where we should be getting ready. And that's why we're at this kind of, World War II moment where, we really just have to commit to building a whole bunch of clean energy because we are way stinking behind. And I know people are like, oh my God, how are we possibly going to get there?
Yeah.
My God, I don't know. How did we beat the Empire of Japan? Which was on a tear in the Pacific? how did we beat the Germans who, were on their own tear through Europe? Well, we got to work on it. We threw our manufacturing might at it. We got behind it as a united country.
Absolutely. I mean, how did we get to the moon?
I don't know if you listen to Rachel Maddow's podcast at all. She did a series called Ultra, which was about the essentially the different fascist movements that formed in this country after World War One and then after World War Two. And in the vicinity of those wars, and people think Trump is a new phenomenon. This is the same old thing, man. We're in a moment of a reactionary politics reacting against what is seen as progressive overreach, whether that's social policy overreach, economic populism overreach. This is what has driven this right-wing movement in this moment, and it's a dangerous blend. This kind of pseudo-economic populism to get the rich what they need, and then sowing hate among people in order to build yourself a majority. And back in the 30s and in the 50s, there was the same talk in these super right-wing circles about how democracy was obsolete, and we had to we have to screw around with the Electoral Count Act and all of that. All of that's happened before. Never went as far as January 6th and the Trump efforts. But, anybody who thinks American exceptionalism is a thing is deluding themselves. This country is susceptible to the same, right-wing populist forces, no matter what, name you put on them, that every other country in history has been subject to. And frankly, the Europeans have had a hell of a problem with neo-fascist movements. Some of them successful. I mean, Italy essentially has a fascist government. Hungary has a fascist government.
Yes, they do.
Poland, until recently, had a fascist government, which, fortunately was pushed out, I think, by the Ukraine crisis as much as anything else, because they weren't that keen on hearing these right-wing knuckleheads talk about how great Putin was, given the history of that country.
Yep.
So it's, all of this stuff is real, and we've really got to be thoughtful and strategic how we reel this back in. And I guess the other thing, I know we're probably getting a little late for you here, but
that's okay. I'm fine.
We have to remember that we don't want a war. If you want a military metaphor, think of it as a rescue mission. Mm-hmm. We don't want any of our fellow Americans to get killed. We want to make sure that, we kind of pull away from this spiral of division. And, that can be done by confronting it directly. And it can also be done by building a better narrative and a better set of policies that really hold people up. I think the Biden administration and the Whitmer administration have done a great job kind of carving that path for us. And through some, really difficult times. Yeah. I think if we can kind of get through this election and then de-escalate a little more and continue delivering, I'm hopeful at this point we're going to, at the very least, hold the executive branch and maybe get the House back. I think the Senate's a heavier lift, frankly, than the House. Yeah. Even given who's holding which House at this time. But particularly if we return with full control of the government, I think we're really at that point in the driver's seat to push a lot of things forward. Yeah. But it's in some ways it's got to be us that de-escalates the rhetoric and just shows professionalism. Look at the progression of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Yep. From a real frontline firebrand member of the squad, and really I think without sacrificing any of her progressive zeal or integrity, she's learned how to be professional. Yep. How to work with all kinds of people in the House, mostly within the Democratic Party, but also across political lines. And, sometimes things line up in weird ways, depending on, which who we're talking about,
Yep.
She's absolutely great at her job. That's a great model of taking, your progressive zeal and then figuring out a really positive agenda you can get behind
Yep.
and moving it forward. And that's, honestly, that's what they were able to do. She comes in, and I believe in 18, they do a good job of kind of getting her warmed up. And by the time Biden, the Biden administration hits the ground, they had really solidified progressive support. And you didn't hear a lot about progressive on, liberal, fussing up in DC during the Biden administration, because they all just figured out what they wanted to do and marched forward in a very effective manner.
Yep.
That's the secret sauce, man, is taking those progressive ideas and figuring out how to implement them in a way
100%, because the 2021-2022 Congress put forth some of the most popular legislation that achieved bipartisan support. Now, look at the 2023-2024 Congress, the most ineffective Congress in definitely within a century at least, because the most legislation they passed was like, what, 40 bills or something like that? That is a record low, essentially. And here's the thing. There are certain, here's the thing. I have not always been a Democrat. For years, I was a staunch independent, but 2020 or 2019, the first Democrat I ever contributed to was Pete Buttigieg, because I'm a huge fan of his. But I'm not looking back now, because the Democratic Party has put forth some of the most popular legislation. And there are people that are conservative that even say, listen, I agree with you. I just can't say it publicly because I'm afraid of retribution. But the fact of the matter is, during 2022, when Governor Whitmer was running for re-election against Tudor Dixon, I remember watching, Republicans, conservative guys, conservative politicians in this state saying, Governor Whitmer, you have done such a great job for the state of Michigan. You've definitely got our support. And, she didn't need to say anything. They basically said it for her. That's that reaching across the aisle. That's what governing is. Being able to reach across that aisle to, do what's right for your constituents. And one of the things I love about, Pete Buttigieg is because when he goes to different parts across the country, he says, it doesn't matter if it's a red state or a blue state. We're all Americans. We're doing this because these are issues that are overwhelmingly popular. That's the kind of America I want to get back to. That's the kind of stuff that I like to see. I like to see legislation that actually is beneficial for the American people, because I have three top main issues I like to focus on. The first one, being a veteran, is veterans issues, of course. Number two is infrastructure. Being a truck driver, I can tell you from experience how important infrastructure is. If your roads aren't maintained, you're not going to be able to deliver on time, or it's going to be delayed, essentially. Makes your job a little bit more difficult. Also, I've worked in OTR. I've worked regional. I've picked up and delivered from rail yards. If rail yards are behind, products are not going to get shipped, because freight makes up about 30%, if I'm not mistaken, of logistics, essentially. And if freight lines are falling apart because, outdated braking systems, where it causes more train collisions or derailments, essentially, the product's not going to get delivered, which causes what? Causes delays, which causes, prices to spike up exponentially, essentially. I mean, it all ties together. The third one is education. But, the reason why I focus on these issues, because they are so tied together. And these are the issues that people do focus upon. Infrastructure definitely is something we focus upon. Especially, and it doesn't matter whether it's urban or rural. It's all tied together. Because, Once again, let's say, for example, you can't get adequate water out to your location. What's that going to do? Especially, around the summertime or even the fall time, essentially. Or let's say, for example, fuel prices spike up, or we have another, excuse me, another strike or something like that, where gas can't get pumped. The crops out there are going to rot out in the field, essentially. I mean, you might be able to get some here and there. It's all tied together. And that's why it's important for us to focus on legislation that actually is important. instead of focusing on all these really petty issues, essentially like, you know, the concept of like trans women competing in women's sports. That's not that important of an issue, honestly. And that's not even something I'm not like in my top 10 things to worry about. But yeah, it's like that culture war shit. I'm sorry, pardon my French, but like it's stuff like that people are worried about when that's like not even a big issue. I'm more concerned about the fact of like, what are we doing as far as like thinking far 5, 10, 15 years down the line, maybe even 50 years down the line. And that's why it's so important for us to focus on like, climate change. Climate change is an issue. I don't care what anybody says. The science is all there. When you've got 97% of scientists across the world saying that climate change is an issue, and we're talking about subject matter experts, people that specialize in this field. If people are telling me that they're wrong because they read it on a blog from Jim Bob that lives in South Carolina, I'm sorry. I'm going to go where the experts go, essentially. And, to kind of like sum everything up, because I know I tend to have a tendency to rant quite a bit. We have to focus on these issues now, because if we don't, in 20 years, we're going to wish we had, essentially. Because if we don't focus on water issues, who knows what might happen 20 years from now? We might find ourselves in a drought. What are we going to do then? Let's say, for example, the power grid starts having fluctuating problems because we can't get enough oil or enough gas plummeting in, because we've got 6 different regions across the world that are engaged in a civil conflict, essentially. And we can't get enough because not all oil that we produce is oil that we use, because we have to export it, and we have to import oil as much as we export, essentially. This is why we have to focus on like, green energy. It's things like this that I truly believe in, that for us to focus on thinking ahead. That's why I believe in like moving forward, because all these issues, whether it's urban or rural, we are all tied together on this. That's why, like, I'm not going back. We aren't going back. Being a progressive is a great way to look at things. So anyway, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine, and you're right. And your issues are solid, and they're ones that come up a lot. Like I said, I don't think there's probably 5, 10 problems, like you said, that if we asked Americans to list them out, would hit the top consistently. And they're the ones we work on consistently. And a lot of them were to the point where we're just going to have to spend some money. I mean, that's how we've made progress on our infrastructure in Michigan during the Whitmer administration. She just found a way to get the money, even though she had a legislature that wouldn't play ball with her. She went out and borrowed it and was like, well, heck with you guys, we're going to go do it anyway. And we made a lot of progress. And, fortunately, the feds brought a whole bunch of money during COVID, and we were able to spend more on the roads and make some real progress.
Yep.
I don't know. I think sometimes we're afraid of our own ability in this country. We're unwilling to
we
put
get
forward.
In our own way. We really get in our own way.
That's a great way to put it. We get in our own way. And whether that's because of social divisions or, an unwillingness to dedicate the resources we need. I even, getting back to rural areas, so often, somebody's like, well, we should have a grant program to deal with XYZ. Do you know how many townships have a grant officer?
Not many.
Maybe 20 out of the 1,460 in this state, would have the resources to have, to be able to sign somebody to really chase grants and deal with them. And it's not that a smaller township might not be able to afford a grant, might not be able to deal with a grant, but again, it's a lot of hoops to jump through and all of that. Whereas if we just said, well, what's a problem that, we know all these places have these problems. Why don't we, get some revenue sharing that's earmarked for such and such and such. We'll give it to the counties. They can redistribute it to the townships. And I'm not saying that's a perfect model for everything, but I am just saying I think there's ways where what seems like a good idea, let's have a grant, it might be a good idea for a relatively small subset of your target audience. But the fact that you have to apply for that grant and manage that grant and write a report about the grant at the end might make it impossible for a lot of your target audience to actually do the process, no matter how worthy the grant would be for the citizens. So there are a lot of things we could be doing to make these things, flow better and work better. Um, no matter what the issue is.
Well, and I think we'll go ahead and get ready to wrap this thing up. But I have like one really big one question as far as this.
You
So
bet.
here's what I'm wondering. Say for example, and I want you to give me your honest opinion about this. Say for example, if we were to, if you're like to pick like a certain county or rural county, and you build like because Governor Whitmer made it to where community college is free, which I am totally okay with, and this was part of the same program. But this was specific to like trade schools. Let's say, for example, CDL training, mechanic work, stuff that is specific to rural areas. Do you think you could probably get like more people would be willing to jump on board for something like that? Because I have a CDL, and I can tell you that is a skill that is great to have because, excuse me, if you kind of a CDL for 1 year without any accidents whatsoever, it's like a golden ticket to get any job anywhere. Because, like I said, I started OTR, went to regional, now I work local. And I tell you, I am happy with what I'm doing right now. But like I also think about like when I drive in like rural areas, what kind of jobs are out there? You got mechanics out there. You've got like small time, business owners. Little small. And what I'm asking basically is like if we were to like have, like a tech school, like a big tech school that works like a community college, but it's very, very specific to like rural communities. Do you think that could be something that can actually make people incentivize people to kind of go to it? Because CDL school when I went was about $9,000, but because I'm retired Army, I didn't have to pay a dime out of it. It came out of my GI Bill essentially, but not everybody has that same opportunity essentially. Plus they have to worry about commute. They have to worry about housing. They have to worry about like how they're going to get to and from there. If there was a way we can kind of incentivize people to like take part in this, do you think that might be something that rural communities might be interested in?
Yeah, I think let me answer this way, and you see if you're satisfied with it.
Okay.
So often when we talk about some factory shuts down and people got displaced, we're like, well, those factory guys need to learn to code. This is the kind of crap that got us mistrusted in rural America, and really among anybody over their middle 40s. These ideas that it's the simplest thing ever to reskill, and that's where our community colleges, different trade schools, union trade programs come in, and so often we we'll go ahead, we'll fund those things like early college and all of that, but we won't think about like what you said. Who's watching the kids while I'm going to CDL school? Who's paying my bills if I'm going to community college full time for a year in order to reskill? So I think there's tremendous potential both for expanding that idea of a couple years of free community college and broadening out eligibility for that. For example, if you don't have a community college in your county, my understanding is that will be difficult to access.
Yep.
It could. I'm not sure I'd swear to that in court, but I believe that's where it's going. So there's definitely details to be looked at to make things like job training or retraining or even that first opportunity that we're asking young people to take advantage of to get that year 14, 15 certification, whether it's a CDL to drive truck, trade certification in welding, whatever we're asking them to do. If you don't have mom and dad's house to live in anymore, that's a really tall order. Yeah. So figuring out how to deal with situations like that in an equitable and fair way, that I think is the bigger problem than access to some of this training overall. And frankly, especially let's call them our second tier colleges and universities. Not Michigan State, not Wayne, not U of M. Places like Lake Superior State, Central Michigan University, Eastern Michigan University. These places are really struggling because they just cannot attract enough young people to, to be able to fill all the seats they've got. I hope that they're looking at broadening out their retraining opportunities, at re-examining who their target audience is, who their target market is. Because if you're one of these schools that's already struggling for students and you're not thinking about how to get into the game of retraining people and maybe providing housing for the full family and support for the full family in order that, people who are displaced by sudden, economic displacement or whatever, could realistically return to college for a couple of years and get a certification, or, even, a lot of people are wandering around with, 40, 50, 60, even 80 credits, and they're a year away from finishing a university degree they started some time ago.
Yep.
There's all kinds of situations out there that you would hope that, as we're struggling to find a use for these universities that are a little underattended right now, you'd hope they're working on that, and you'd hope there's some help in the legislature, or sometimes the the legislature offers a little carrot, or gives them a little push. There's definitely a discussion to be had about those broader education issues. Now, I don't know if Lake State is going to want to teach people how to drive a semi. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But, it might be a question to ask about, what are the skills we really need out there?
Yep.
And who's available and has resources and might be able to do some of that teaching or host some of those teachers.
And I'm telling you, I speak from experience. Being a truck driver, it's definitely a different lifestyle. But I tell you what, though, the reason why I like doing it is because I feel like I am a part of keeping America running. Because, the first delivery I made, I picked up a load from with my trainer from Atlanta, Georgia, to Memphis, Tennessee, and it was an Old Dominion yard we drove into, and I found it was medical supplies. It took me about 20 minutes because this is my first time actually backing into a real dock,
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I backed in, they started unloading me. I realized that I was really an essential part of, because after 3 days, if truck drivers quit driving, after 3 days, the entire country would just kind of fall apart. And are there a lot of regulations regarding truck driving? Yes, there is. But they're there for a reason. But the thing is, depending on what company you go to, the pay is phenomenal. It is great. But like I said, it takes a certain kind of person to do it. But the thing is, that's why I brought up, being a mechanic, being a tractor mechanic, or, even working in a salon, because those are the kind of jobs that are in rural communities that people can get job training from. Coding is severely underrated, and jobs like that can be available. But the reason why I ask this is because why jobs why jobs like this, or teaching like this, could be more available, because some jobs it's on the job training, which there's nothing wrong with that, but just think about what kind of you could get some of this fresh out of a tech school, and they just jump right into their job and they are just rip roaring, and you just got to do a little fine tuning here and there. That's why I was asking, because I thought about this. Why aren't there more schools that are as widely used like this, not specified just specifically in truck driving, but in this and this? Because I see trucks all over the rural communities. I see tractors all over the rural communities. I see many different kinds of jobs all over the rural communities. And people talk about well, there's not enough jobs around here. Well, why do you say there's not enough jobs? Do you just not have the qualifications? Do you not have the certifications? Because let's say, for example, if Joe Snuffy over here wants to go work for Richard Brewer, who owns a farm, but the thing is, he doesn't have experience for it. Maybe a tech school of some sort, a community college that can offer a program like that could actually benefit for something like that. I mean, this is just me, spitballing here, but
right.
It's things like that, because this is why, like, I feel like issues like this could all be tied together essentially. And I know it's like a big ask, and I know this is not something that can be done overnight, but excuse me, I'm sorry. But I keep thinking, suppose if like there was more opportunities like this, even if they're like small colleges, small universities, something like this, that are spread out in the rural regions, you could actually create more opportunities for people out there instead of like, well, I gotta, go to a university and spend like, get $60,000 in student loans. I mean, I don't want to go into student loans too much, but you kind of get where I'm getting at, right?
Well, sure. And I think it's a very important for many different institutions, and education is a great example, to be kind of reevaluating what their mission is. And that goes for, everybody from elementary school all the way through higher education. There's so much information available
Yes,
on
there
these
is.
goofy little things. And, we're in an interesting moment where probably the most important skill to use this thing is having a vigorous bullshit detector.
Yep.
And it's like all of those classic ideas in argument and rhetoric and all of that
Yeah.
are even more important. Those ideas from ancient Greece are even more important today using this thing than they've ever been before, because there is such a deluge of information mixed with misinformation. I like to say this thing is so dangerous because you stroke it like a pet and it tells you what you want to hear.
Yep.
It just kind of feeds your lizard brain and your need to be right and your ego and all of that. And it's so dangerous if you don't have some of those critical thinking skills. So you can say, well, why is such and such saying this? So I think there's going to be a whole lot of change necessary in all kinds of these different institutions, and all of that's going to get scrambled by whatever's coming at us from climate change, because it really appears to be accelerating in ways that are, just going to be absolutely devastating to certain parts of the world and certain industries. So it's, we really need to be trying to build a time where we can have thoughtful discussions with all of our different sectors, all of our different citizens, in order to really move things forward effectively. Because we really cannot continue this, this whiplashing back and forth between the policies of the two different parties, particularly as they've diverged and become more extreme. I would argue much more extreme on the right than the left.
Yeah.
But to have a presidential candidate who wants to abandon NATO and is still going on and on about how, climate change isn't real and electric cars are a bad idea. I mean, these are obviously ridiculous, but they're being eaten up by a lot of people. And, should we be so fortunate as to prevail decisively this year and have control of the government, a big part of what we've got to do is figure out how to de-escalate with our neighbors and, and bring them into a more productive political discussion.
Certainly.
And I, frankly, rural America is a good place to start looking for models of this. We're kind of out here without so many people to choose from. So when we've got to run local government, we can't just, find a bunch of cronies to sit on all the boards and all the commissions and all of that. We got to use whoever's willing to show up. So we've been doing it out here for a long time. You talked about people who don't want to admit that they're Democrats. There are people in this county who, if our politics were less crazy, would be Democrats. They would be successfully elected Democrats, probably have a little more conservative flavor, a little more maybe pragmatic and traditional in their views, but still recognizably Democrats. Until we spend time out here actually getting to know our neighbors, actually succeeding as Democrats in political endeavors, until we fly our flag and make ourselves clearly identifiable as productive members of the community, we're not going to be able to do that. That's why I say job one is showing up and job two is telling a story about our values. Period. I mean, if we can start doing those two things over many years of effort, we will hopefully get to the point where we can elect, a Democratic county commissioner in Allegan County.
Yeah, that's
There's
so
a goal.
It's not a tall order, but it seems so.
Oh, it's a tall order. It's a super tall order.
It is a tall order, but I'm so glad that you brought that up, though. Yeah, more people just need to kind of step up and realize that there's a lot of us out there. I mean, it's just I can't even begin to describe it really, but it's just we are out there and we are as pragmatic as we possibly can be, and I don't vote Democrat simply because I don't like Trump. It's because I do believe in the policies and what we stand for, essentially.
Yeah. And that's the pivot you've seen as Biden dropped out and Harris came on. The Harris campaign is not talking endlessly about how much Trump sucks.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes up, but it's mostly about putting that positive vision out front. Where the Biden campaign was all just Trump's terrifying and we did a good job. And that clearly was getting us nowhere. I really think, like you said, this positive message, this idea of moving forward, and this idea of getting things done. This is the path where we can actually get to something that gets us a popular majority in some of these areas and in some of these rural areas.
Absolutely,
it's going to take time and it's going to take a lot of showing up and just doing the job.
Absolutely.
Doing whatever the job they'll give you out here in the rural areas, take it, run with it.
Absolutely. So, well, anyway, Mark, I just want to say I appreciate your time. This has actually been really, really, really informative, and because I feel like I've learned a great deal about the purpose of the Rural Caucus, and how do people get involved with the Rural Caucus? What's for people, are there any committees or any meetings that you have or something like that, any Zoom meetings or something?
No, that's great. Thanks for asking the question. The Michigan Democratic Party Rural Caucus is a constituency caucus of the Michigan Democratic Party. So if you want to join our Rural Caucus, you got to join the party. That doesn't mean you can't interact with us on our Facebook page. That's a good way to keep up on what's going on. If you just search for Michigan Democratic Party Rural Caucus, you will find us. We typically have an executive committee meeting on the first Monday of the month, and then a general membership meeting on the second Monday of the month, both at 7:00. Our executive committee consists of your typical, chair, vice chair, treasurer, secretary, but also 13 who each have roughly 5 counties each, and in a lot of ways are the backbone of the Rural Caucus. They actually get out there and help, for example, stand up county parties when they go defunct because, the last active Democrat in the county died or something like that. So that's how to get involved. We are always looking for more people to participate with us. We do have some committees. We do have an endorsement committee. We do endorse candidates. And we also have a fundraising /PAC committee that raises funds and then distributes them to our endorsed candidates. So those are the big ways to get involved. We will also have a summit in 2025, end of April or beginning of May, depending on once we've actually nailed down our venue. We'll put that information out there. That's kind of an expensive way to join us the first time, to go up north for a couple of days and meet with us. But we are, that summit is a very good time, and it really, if you want to kind of jumpstart your involvement with rural democracy from the Democratic side, that's a great way to do it, is to attend that summit.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time here. I feel like this was really just it's like trying to drink water from a fire hose at times because there's so much information there. but still, like, I definitely do appreciate it, and I hope more people watch this to kind of get themselves more educated on, like, what are the most essential issues for the rural community. And hopefully the right people see videos like this, because, you know, it's our livelihood. We are regular people. These are the issues that we focus upon, and these are the issues that need to be heard, essentially. So, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Alex. Anytime. Do it annually or something.
Absolutely. I mean, we can definitely like make this like an annual thing and whatnot. I mean, or like just every so often, just like, hey, listen, I want to bring you up to speed on something, and just let me know, and I'll definitely bring you on.
All right. Now, hit me up. You need a guest. We'll figure something out to talk about.
Fantastic. Let everybody know where they might be able to find you, and like the website and whatnot, before we close out.
You can find us at, oh God, I should know that off the top of my head. Like I said, Michigan Democratic Rural Caucus on Facebook is your easy search. That search will also get you where you need to go on Google. I'm killing time while I pull it up. I believe it is MDP Rural Caucus.
The website.com, yes.
Yes.
Yep, mdpruralcaucus.com.
Yes, that's the one.
Absolutely.
I should really write that down ahead of interviews.
That's okay. I have a printer right here. I didn't even think about it, so I was like, wait, I got it right here. So, but yeah,
there you go.
But yeah, like if anybody wants to reach out to Mark or just like address any issues they might have, just go to Facebook page, Michigan Democrat Rural Caucus, and they'll probably get back to you. So, Mark, once again, thank you so much, and hopefully I get to see you again, maybe like at another convention of some sort. The next Democratic state convention's in 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, right?
No. Typically, the Michigan Democratic Party is going to meet at least every spring for a spring convention, and then we'll meet in the fall for a nominating convention in the even-numbered years. The nominating convention is because of Michigan's squirrely thing of, the parties nominating state Supreme Court, university trustees, and all of that.
All right.
We get together a little more often than that.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, listen, you've got my contact information. You know where to reach me and whatnot. But other than that, Mark, I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy your Labor Day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, sir.
Thanks, Alex. Right back at you. We'll see you out there on the road, buddy.
Take care now.